Hello there. Welcome back to Latest Community Talk. Thanks again so much for tuning in. We have a guest on the line with us tonight, Jim Simpson. Hello, sir.
Hey, Debbie. How are you?
Very well. Glad to have you on the line. And I told our listeners before you came on that you were an investigative journalist is one title, I guess, but you've also been an economist. And I want to tell about the books you've written, though. You've written 4 books: The Red-Green Axis, Refugees, Immigration, and the Agenda to Erase America. And I guess I just want to talk about that one mainly.
Yeah.
Okay. So
Sure.
we hear people talking about the refugee situation with ISIS and Syrian refugees. But here in America, there's a whole nother refugee issue unrelated really in any way to ISIS. And you've gotten really involved in this understanding better the Refugee Resettlement Act. How did you get involved in trying to figure out this issue out?
Well, I was asked to write an article about the issue, and like it says, my title is investigative journalist, so I get pretty deep into the weeds. That's what I'm known for, and that request culminated in that short book, The Red-Green Axis, and it pretty much describes the entire refugee resettlement program as it stands today, which is nothing like the refugee program that most of us have in our minds when we think of it.
Well, I was going to say the Refugee Resettlement Act was like 1980 law that basically was trying to help people who may have, after Vietnam or in that era, help people who were really refugees and potentially facing persecution to get to come to America, but the program has morphed.
Well, actually, before 1980, that was what the program addressed. The program, prior to 1980, the whole program changed in 1980. The 1980 Refugee Act was written largely by Teddy Kennedy with some help from Joe Biden, who was a senator then. And Teddy Kennedy, just as with the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act, which he also was the prime mover behind, the goal was to refocus immigration in all its dimensions towards third world populations, needy third world populations with little understanding or little belief in the United States way of doing things, because they are needy populations. And guess what? That's the Democrats' calling card. Find a needy population, fill them up with welfare, and you have a voter for life. And that's what his goal was, both in the 1965 Immigration Act and the 1980 Refugee Act. So the Refugee Act of 1980 really significantly, substantially changed the entire character. And it took us away from people like the boat people from Vietnam who were fleeing communism. It refocused away from people who were fleeing oppressive governments like the communists and towards people the Central Americans, people in Africa, and specifically it also focused our efforts towards those countries, those areas, like, for example, Central America, where we were involved and the left was adamantly opposed to our involvement.
So sympathy for some of the people, but I want to jump forward to today. So we have this refugee resettlement program has grown, and at this point that we bring people, the UN is largely selecting the refugees who come to America rather than America selecting them. This is a program affiliated with the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, and so they're kind of choosing them. And so, I mean, I guess I want to get to why are you concerned about this? What's the reason to be concerned?
Okay, well, there's just immense number of reasons to be concerned. First of all, A refugee used to be a person who, as a person facing persecution, would come to the United States. We gave them shelter. We offered them a place to flee to. We did not make living in our country an entitlement. That was the main change of the 1980 Refugee Act. It turned our country in. It made us essentially the wards of refugees. Prior to that time, people would come here. They would come and assimilate and produce. Today, they come here in many cases to take advantage of our generous welfare benefits, and that's borne out in the statistics. For example, since 2008, 90% of all Middle Eastern refugees remain on food stamps, and close to 70% remain on some form of cash assistance. And some of these people stay on these programs for life. But the UN High Commissioner increasingly took a role in selecting the refugees. That wasn't a condition of the 1980 Refugee Act, but the 1980 Refugee Act was inspired by the 1976 UN Conference on Human Settlements, which essentially dictated settlement policies for countries for the world. And we, of course, until we got a left-wing Democrat in office, weren't really paying attention to that. But when Jimmy Carter came in, we did. So we took the UN's settlement agenda, which was to redistribute populations around the world. Had nothing to do with saving oppressed refugees. It had to do with redistributing populations. So, for example, the Somalis have to live in this nasty, hot desert, and we get to live in this verdant, green, beautiful country. Well, that's not fair. So the Somalis should be able to resettle to the United States. It's a socialist in its conception and socialist in its goal, but it goes beyond just redistributing income. It talks about redistributing populations, redistributing land, and redistributing resources.
You know what? We're at a really good point where, can you hold on during a break? We need to go to a break here.
Absolutely.
I'm so glad you can. We're speaking with Jim Simpson, who's an investigative reporter, and I just can hardly wait to come back after the break and tell you about what's happening in Texas and how much of this refugee resettlement is happening kind of behind closed doors, without notifying people who are going to be having these new people as their neighbors, and also the involvement of VOLAGs, these charities allegedly helping these people, and what's happening, how you're being duped into letting them make a bunch of money of your tax dollars to resell these people. So, Debbie Georgatos, Ladies Can We Talk? Come back after our break. Can you hear? Okay, welcome back to Ladies Can We Talk? We are on the line with Jim Simpson. So I want to fast forward to today. We're talking with Jim Simpson about the Refugee Resettlement Program. And I will tell you, you see stories all over the internet and online about this subject of the Refugee Resettlement Program. Why has it come so much to public attention in this time? What's going on that's causing people concern?
Well, we're becoming overwhelmed. We've been going whole hog with this program since 1980, and in the beginning, nobody really noticed, and, it was resettlement of small numbers of people in rural or suburban communities that nobody really notices, nobody pays attention. But over time, the problems become insurmountable. For example, in Lewiston, Massachusetts, the Somali population there grew from essentially zero in the mid to late 90s to 15% of the population today. There's over 40 languages spoken in Lewiston public schools. Their English as a second language budget has increased 4,000% since the year 2000. In Amarillo, Texas, people have to answer 911 calls in 36 different languages. It costs $1,300 per pupil per month to tutor students in English because none of them speak English. The problems, and these are just single examples. The problems are numerous all over the place, and in many communities, they're just drowning in refugees and their attendant problems. And it's not limited to budgetary problems, although that's a big part of it, that they really cause havoc in schools. In Manchester, New Hampshire, the mayor of Manchester told me that they speak 82 different languages in Central High School now. How do you teach with a student body like that? How do you even run English as a second language program when some of the languages that these people speak are dialects that nobody's ever heard of before? There's no known, they're unknown languages, and there's no interpreters. And so they turn around and sue the city because they can't get the interpreters they need. And that's just the budgetary problem. There's also crime problems. There's assimilation problems. It goes on and on.
Well, this is so interesting to talk about because I think that America's always had a kind of noble sense of, we take your huddled masses, we want to help the poor, we're a big nation, we can absorb people. But I know many stories, you alluded to several and just a minute ago, and I've just read and heard them myself, of just communities where all of a sudden the community's changed, and it does not appear the refugees coming here actually want to assimilate or not being invited to assimilate. So I want to give you a chance, though, to tell our listeners, too, about the role of these VOLAGs, these voluntary groups, and what their role in all this is.
Well, first of all, they're misnamed. They're called voluntary agencies, but they're not voluntary at all. They're resettlement contractors. 6 of them are nominally religious. I say nominally because they have religion in their name. For example, the Church World Service, or the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Service, or the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, the Episcopal Migration Ministry. These are heavy-duty resettlement contractors, and they make, at this point, close to $2 billion a year, about $5,000 per head to resettle refugees and the unaccompanied alien youths. They're not children, but it's a massive, big business. And we are living with the perception of the refugee program as, helping people in dire need. But what it's really become is a business that is designed to fuel and support the radical left's agenda for this country, which is to pack it with huge populations of needy people to increase their
voting
ability
base
to get votes, and also to overwhelm our nation with problems. That's another strategy that the left is very good at, and President Obama learned at the feet of the masters. So there's nothing charitable about this. And the thing that really disturbs me is that these church groups are being the leaders of these VOLAGs are resettlement contractors. They're government contractors, but they're selling the program as though it's this wonderful, inspired, God-inspired, charitable operation to help people from all over the world, and nothing could be further from the truth. People are in the United States are well-meaning. We are the most generous people in the world, and we respond to those kinds of messages. And we see all of these pictures in the press and about waves of immigration, the waves of migrants going into Europe, and all the problems in Syria, and the people getting beheaded, and it all gets conflated together to where they then turn around and say, can't we save these people? But there's so much misinformation about it. It's hard to describe, and you have to understand, your audience has to understand that this is profit-driven for these VOLAGs. This has nothing to do with charity. It's not charity. They are nonprofit. In other words, they don't pay taxes. They should, but it is not charity.
You know, this is an interesting thing. We're very close to when we got to wrap up the top of the hour, but you know, this what we're listening to is another example of something I mentioned earlier, that even with respect to the amnesty program for people in America who entered illegally, and the left is always pushing amnesty. They're pushing amnesty for illegal immigrants because they want them to be voters. And this is another way, as you say, that to bring more people to America that the left assumes will be left-wing voters, will be people they can
correctly assume.
Yeah. So you know what? We are out of time here, but if someone wanted more information, do you have a website to tell them they could go to?
Well, they should get my book, The Red Green Axis. It's a top seller at Amazon. They could go to the Center for Security Policy's website and look at all their information about refugees. My book and Corcoran's book called The Hijra. There's a number of books on this subject there, and there is also a if somebody really wants to get involved, they can sign up at the Center for Security Policy's Refugee Activism page, and they just fill out, name, email address, and somebody will contact them, and they can talk about if and how they would like to be involved in doing something about this issue, because it's literally threatening the very fabric of our country. It threatens our security, threatens our safety. It is unfair, and it is extremely expensive.
It is. We are speaking with Jim Simpson. Thank you so much for calling in tonight. Folks, we're going to come back. We have 15 seconds.